everybody. I'll try my best to speak loudly so you can hear me. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on what we're doing here and about our composer, Marenzio. This is our Madrigal Madness workshop for a combination of our regular ARTEK singers and some younger singers who apply to be part of this, to sing madrigals, some of them for the first time, perhaps in their careers. And they're all actually very accomplished singers already, but this music of the 16th and early 17th century is new to a lot of people. And we also had a focus in this particular workshop of not only learning the madrigals, but also in learning the style of the late 16th century, which involves vocal ornamentation, which is not well known today that was standard normal practice. Most of the concerts you hear, nobody ornaments, and that is actually not the way they did it. So we are trying to change the world a bit here, and you will hear some interesting moments. If you're not following the score, you may not realize what they're adding, but they're adding a lot. So I'm going to introduce everybody to you. This is Mara Yaffee, one of our fellows, Austin Cody, Anna Willson, Peter Becker, and going back, Sishel Claverie, Laura Heimes, Bill Heigen, and Robin Bier. So then you can put names to the faces that you see. Hopefully I've got the list of who sings which madrigal, right? Luca Marenzio. In his time, he was probably much more famous than Monteverdi. His music was published and went as far as England. Everybody in England knew his most famous pieces. And the famous musicologist Dennis Arnold called him the Schubert of the madrigal, in fact, because he published 17 books of madrigals in just 2 decades, contrasted with Monteverdi, who had 8 books over 5 decades. And of course, Marenzio's madrigals are all in the 16th century style, whereas Monteverdi really only has that style for about 3 or 4 books before he goes on to the new style of the 17th century. These madrigals are all from Book 9, which was Marenzio's last published book, and in fact, he died in 1599. So it has a little bit of that art of the fugue quality of, a composer of many decades who tries new, possibly weird, possibly kind of out there musical ideas, and you will hear some of those. It's dedicated to Monteverdi's future boss in Mantua, Vincenzo Gonzaga. So it is his most Mantuan collection, and it's actually the closest in style to Monteverdi and Jacques de Vert, but it's still very different. Like Monteverdi, Marenzio was intellectually involved with the text, and he focused all his invention and wit on bringing out the meaning of the words. But in his earlier style, in Marenzio's earlier style, that meant using pictorial word painting, images in music, using things like, on words like valleys, the music goes very low, and hills, the music goes very high, or springs, and you have yada-da-da-da-da-da-da to show springs of water. And a lot of counterpoint between the voices, but the later style concentrates on the psychological impact of the poetry, less image-oriented and more mood-oriented. So there's a new emphasis on the top voice as the most important conveyor of expression, imitation of the accents of passion, gasps. We say I a lot. We say sospiro, which means sigh, unexpected leaps, all of which portray an exaggerated emotional life. So it's less contrapuntal and more declamatory, thus it's a more dramatic delivery of text. You got that? More dramatic. All right. I keep saying act more. So it's no accident that one of the poets here that you'll hear today, Guarini, he was actually a playwright and not just a lyricist. And that was a big shift that Marenzio made after 1593 to using these more modern poets of Guarini and Tasso, where the characters are constantly faced with threats of death, separation, deception, and rape. The extremity of their situations required more radical musical means, angular vocal writing, frequent chromaticism, nervous shifts in range and rhythm, lots of exclamations. But about half the poems set in Book 9 are Petrarchs. Now, Petrarch is quite a bit before, and we even have one from Dante, which is very old. Now, these show Marenzio's preference for what they call the in morte poems. In morte means in death. So they are collectively more somber and gloomy, pessimistic, and obsessed with death. And I'm sorry to say that of the ones I chose, at least 3 of them definitely fall into the gloomy category, at least in parts of them. And in them, what's really happening, even though he doesn't say the name, is Petrarch is lamenting the death of Laura and contrasting his present unhappy state with his earlier happiness. Sometimes he calls upon death to end his misery. So who is this Laura that Petrarch so liked? Well, that was his ideal lover. She was sort of in his mind. Petrarch saw Laura at St. Clare's Church in Avignon during the Easter liturgy and falls in love with her at first sight. He is captivated by her beauty, which haunted him for the rest of his life. His heart is filled with such love that he can't really act on his feelings. I think this was all like a love affair of the mind, more than anything else. So that's kind of the subtext that you need to understand when you read the words of the Petrarch poems. Let's see. So the older poems by Dante and Petrarch have longer lines. They are either 7 syllables or 11 syllables. The Guarini are much shorter, and it makes a change in the way Marenzio can set them. And you will hear, I think, that the Guarini poems are much more like what we think of as normal madrigals, because our ears nowadays are pretty tuned to the madrigals of Monteverdi, who set a lot of Guarini also. Guarini's texts feature amorous subtleties and paradoxes gracefully turned into verse. So, for example, it's like, I love you, no I don't. I love you so much, my heart is full of joy, but I think I'm gonna die. That's the Guarini kind of thing, whereas the Petrarch is a little bit more, I don't want to say thoughtful, but I mean it's more about mood and less about poetic wit. And you'll see that the madrigals set to Petrarch are longer in the phrases and rely more on the counterpoint for the chromaticism as opposed to sort of shocking, sudden chromaticism. I mean, there are exceptions in each one, but what often happens for the chromaticism is that one harmony is playing and another one starts, but the old one keeps holding and then eventually resolves. And sometimes you have kind of 3 chords stacked on one another that gradually go away. And you won't find that so much in the Guarini. That's more like little cute turns of phrase. So, we're going to start with Credete voi by Guarini, just to give you something rather charming to start with, not too gloomy. But this one, poetry is full of contradictions between love that nourishes the heart and fosters life versus the denial of love because its absence leads to death. So you see, nourishes the heart, absence makes you die. So life, When it comes to the word vivo, that is portrayed with animated rhythms and consonant counterpoint. Death is treated with slower notes and more dissonance. All right, Credete board. Madrigal is actually a two madrigal set, and this is the one by Dante. So Marenzio placed this first in Book 9 to establish the mostly sad tone of the rest of the poetry. So in that sense, it is programmatic because Marenzio signals that he is being drawn to words like aspre, cruda, durezza. You'll see those in the poetry. I hope you watch the poetry while we sing, very important, which sound as harsh as their meaning. Harsh in terms of the harmony, really piles up the dissonances. In fact, it's hard, even for me, I'm playing what we call a keyboard intabulation, which was typical of the time as well, a lute player usually, or a keyboard. It's hard to decide which chord to play when you have a choice of notes from 3 different harmonies at the same time. The poem opens with a declaration, I want my words to be as harsh as my beautiful, stony beloved's deeds are. So there's something very hard and harsh about the dissonances that you hear. And it's quite slow to really emphasize. It's kind of like, almost like a grindstone, if you think about the stone meaning, grinding the dissonances together. The poet later compares her, in fact, to jasper, which is a hard stone that even an arrow cannot penetrate, which is apparently an erotic reference, but we cannot talk about that. it's a hard stone, which is an arrow. So in the arrow is one place where you still have the word painting. You'll hear the arrow has dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, kind of a, which is like a meaning of the word painting so that you're shooting the arrow into the air, literally with the notes of the melody. In the second half, Dante suggests that she inflicts mortal blows against which he is defenseless. Marenzio doesn't really use many pictorial madrigalisms here, so much as the mode to create the sense of cruelty. You'll hear right in the beginning that, what mode is it in? It starts this, and then suddenly immediately it's, and then it's this again. Things like that. So you are kept off balance by the harmony, which doesn't always have a clear direction that we're accustomed to with later Baroque music, where everything is kind of going to the goal of 5-1 to cadence and make tie off your phrase harmonically. This is kind of, we're here in this mode, but now we're here in another mode, which is part of, it's a very difficult piece to sing. I think they'd all agree. This is the hardest one that we sang, and that kind of amorphous harmony makes it hard to really have a sense of where you're going when you sing it, but we have solved all of that. The use of sharps traditionally was associated with harshness, and flats with the opposite. Sharps often go along with chromatic motion and dissonance, and Marenzio uses plenty of both to match the harshness of the words. Also, the rhythm seems hesitant instead of flowing at the beginning, as though the composer was having a hard time expressing his thoughts. This, again, what mode are we in? I'm not sure. It's kind of the composer like, I don't know what I want to do. There is the pictorial madrigalism on the word saetta, and you'll hear a few more on some of the other words here and there. So, but mostly you'll hear this kind of harshness throughout the whole piece.
Così,
have a double madrigal with two parts, so it's two madrigals in one. Dura legge by Petrarch. The opening line is in a very slow dissonant motion to portray the hard, the dura, the hard law of love. At the word pero, which means but, Marenzio signals the contrast by using faster rhythms. And at the sentence, now I know how the heart disintegrates, he breaks up the voices as they exchange small, quick motives to illustrate the heart breaking apart and disintegrating. Other things you might want to listen for is the contrast between the drawn-out cadence on the word peace and the animated motive on the word war. Also, at the beginning of the second part, I know how in a moment it dissolves, which is what is dissolving? The heart, the pain, sort of all of it. Listen to how the voices suddenly disappear for an unusually long rest. How at the words fear or shame, the soprano alternates between two different long notes against the lower voices. And I have to tell you, this is my favorite part of everything you will hear today, because it's not that she alternates against two notes, but she's alternating between B flat and B, B flat and B, and then C and C sharp, C and C sharp. Again, that wavering kind of quality. And she's doing that against the lower voices who seem to be debating the reason. The serpent hidden among the flowers, the long way, is depicted by long notes in the middle voice, while the other voices portray the fiori, the flowers, cluster around it, noodle, 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 hiding it from view. So it could be almost as much visual, because when you look at it on the page, you see the long string and then noodle, noodle around it, but you can hear it too. The piece ends as it began, reverting to the same slow motion, but now depicting the dying and languishing serpent, the serpent being the metaphor for the poets, the dying serpent being the metaphor for the poets' hard law of love. do want to mention that these lovely notes I'm providing for you are partly mine, but are mostly those of Barbara Hanning, who normally gives the commentary for the Madrigal Madness and does a far better job than I do. But she wrote notes for me on some of the poetic relationships in the music. That is her specialty, and we're very sorry she's, I think, off in Italy or someplace, so I really feel sorry that she couldn't be here today, but at least if she's not here, she's in someplace great. And I just wanted to say, originally we were supposed to have 6 Madrigal Madness Fellows, a lovely young baritone named Jack Innes, who did one of our recorded pieces last year on the concerts we put online. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and he was going to come for this. Well, he had a plane. It was supposed to take off Thursday. Delta pilots didn't have enough pilots, so it was canceled to Friday morning. Okay, well, we didn't have a lot of rehearsal, but all right, if you're late, we'll manage, you know. Friday morning, I got the call, 6:30. That plane has been canceled. There's only like 2 planes a day out of Madison to LaGuardia, and of course, they've already canceled everybody from the day before, as well as that day. So not only could he not get here Friday, he couldn't even get here this morning to sing at least one of them because they couldn't get him on the plane. I guess there are so many people. So, and we've had our share of transportation problems with the New Jersey trains being canceled. Maybe some of you know about this, but between pilots canceling and trains canceling, I feel very fortunate that we've managed to have a concert for you. So there was originally going to be 6 madrigals, but we decided in the interest of, our tenors took up Jack's parts at the last minute. So we are doing 5 madrigals rather than 6. So to replace that 6th madrigal, I'm going to do 1 madrigal for you on the keyboard. And this is another practice of the 16th century where keyboard players, or indeed all instruments, they would take an existing vocal madrigal or motet, they would make an entabulation of it. And they did this by first condensing part books, because remember, no scores, part books. They would sort of make something like a score, but in a keyboard tablature, which is like a code, like A, C, B, and little signs for the rhythm. They would first do that, and then they would add ornamentation. And so there are many examples. It's not completely clear to me if one is meant to really perform these or if they were merely meant to teach people how to make these madrigals, and these were examples of the ornaments and embellishments you could add to the madrigal. So I've played many of these for years. If you have any of my organ recordings, you'll hear a ton of them because I play on organs from the 16th and 17th centuries mostly. And starting about a couple years ago, I decided that I needed to do what they did, which is take a madrigal and do my own ornamentation of it. I had played enough that I kind of had a sense, and I sort of chose which style, because that changes over the years a bit, the embellishments. And so this is now a madrigal by a man named Pietro Vinci, which I did this for a program we did a number of years ago called Lasciatemi morire. So this is another madrigal on those famous words, let me die, which we know from Monteverdi, but actually there were a number of other composers who did madrigals on this, and Pietro Vinci is a Neapolitan composer, and it has really kind of wonderful harmonic progressions, and I made the entabulation and I ornamented it, and now I'll play it for you. other aspect to the performance practice of these madrigals, which I am always very firm about, that one must perform them in the correct key. And I have to say, we've had generations of certain famous English groups, choral groups, singing music meant for one to a part, in the wrong keys. Why? Well, we have a lot of ladies that like to sing, and some of them are sopranos, and some of them are altos. And if you know the performance practice, you know that if you see a certain set of clefs, it means that you read it as a note a fourth lower than you would normally read that note in the clef. So I call this just learning to read the clef correctly as opposed to transposing it, because when it goes down a fourth, or sometimes a fifth, down a fourth, what that does is it makes all the alto parts the realm of the countertenor, as opposed to our poor modern female altos, with the exception of our lovely ladies here who love their low notes. I'm sure you've already realized that, but you know, if you imagine a college group, you know, they somehow think an alto doesn't sing below an A, below middle C, but that was actually the first note for a soprano at this time. So, and also if you think about, let's say, a young group again at the college, you don't have a lot of real basses. Fortunately, we have Peter, who has low notes. So many of the pieces that we know and love today from the 16th century, especially Palestrina, Victoria, Lassus, Josquin, some of them we know from the right key, but not so many because they're, you know, lower. The pieces, a lot of the pieces that we know are being sung a fourth too high, which makes the soprano part kind of high and squeaky, but you know, sopranos love to sing high, but you know, they get over that if they sing with me enough. And so the first piece you heard was transposed down a fourth from the version you will see if you look this up online on the famous choral public domain site. And the next two pieces are also a fourth lower. The pieces, the two double ones were written in that clef. So those did not need to be transposed, as you say. And the range is pretty close, exactly the same now with the other ones transposed. So there's another special thing about this one that we do next, Credete. This is written in a special meter, sort of an archaic meter, where instead of the tactus being a half note, as in the first ones, the tactus in this one is a whole note. And this very slow motion, because it's sort of an old-fashioned misura di breve, the breve is the sort of double whole, as though the composer really wants to milk all the expression out of the dissonances, of which there are many, which you can imagine with words like crudel and acerba, which means bitter. He makes them last longer so listeners can't help but experience the pain through listening. The chromaticism and dissonance is the language of extreme sorrow. Also the weird harmonies and unusual cadences. For the words, my deep sighs will not fit into verse, and my great torment defies any style. And you will hear that the ending is not quite the normal cadence. It feels a little bit unfinished. All right, Credete. Our last madrigal is by Guarini. So this pulls us out of our sort of gloomy mood of all the Petrarchian and Dante madrigals. And parto o non parto is typical of a Guarini text. It's full of opposites between going and staying, between body and soul, and life and death, and oxymorons like a living death. Also, there are exclamations like the word "I," which just means like "hi." You know, it's not, doesn't have a meaning. It's just a anguish, an expression of anguish. It appears in the poem only twice, but in the musical score it appears 8 times, amplified by Marenzio's counterpoint. It's translated musically as a long high note followed by descending shorter notes. Shall I leave or not? Marenzio opens the piece by having the voices act out this question. Pairs of voices start out separately and then come together in repeated short phrases. The other poetic contrasts are illustrated musically by pitting ascending and descending lines, longer and shorter notes, togetherness, more like homophonic chordal singing of the same words, and separateness, imitative counterpoint. And it's such an evocative text, to leave or not to leave. I mean, we can think of many famous departure songs in early Baroque music. I mean, I'm thinking of a little bit of Pur timuro at the end of Popea. You know, the idea of two lovers parting has always drawn some of the most poignant musical expressions from composers.